Hello, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you a little bit more information about behavioral science, behavioral economics, just so you had a little bit more working information, and then you can look at some of the sources for the homework that you have. There is a chapter in your textbook on behavioral economics, and again, if you have an interest in it, it's something that we can go back to after the AP exam. We were starting to look at two videos in class. One was by Dan Ariely, about his work, Predictably Irrational. He's a behavioral economist. The second individual that's really important to mention is Daniel Kahneman. His more recent work is called Systems Fast and Slow, and it's really about two systems that he puts his finger on. One which is System 1, which is kind of automatic pilot, for lack of a better word. You know what it's like if you're, on your way home from school and you're not really thinking so much about, even when I'm driving and listening to the radio on the way home, I'm making decisions about which way to go and how to go, or whether I'm going to stop at the store, or things like that. But I don't really, put a lot of thinking, into my decision making. It's part of my routine. There's a lot of habitual, stuff that I'm doing, and I'm, on automatic pilot while I'm driving home. We kind of all know what it's like to make decisions in System 1, that part of your brain that's kind of operating automatically. But this is also a place where a great deal of mistakes are made, and sometimes we rely on System 1, and we are, quick to judge somebody, or quick to make a lot of information that may not be accurate based on a whole bunch of cognitive biases. Kahneman kind of suggests that we do have System 2, so we're capable of a great deal of complex thinking, but this is really very much something that we use when we want to employ it, and sometimes we actually work pretty hard to avoid it. Our shortcuts kind of kick in where needed, because they, evolutionary wise, save us some energy. So he talks a lot about thinking fast and slow, and a lot of the work that Daniel Kahneman has done in an area of behavioral economics called prospect theory, relates to the way in which System 1 operates. So a lot of the flaws in our thinking, and that's partly what we're looking at when we're looking at behavioral science. The other, thing that we can just kind of note is that there is a difference between these economic models, where economists create kind of these models, and in the case of utility functions and utility theory, the whole idea is to really enable us to be able to measure decisions that we make based on models that can kind of predict the outcome. We make assumptions about us being rational. And, the left-hand column here suggests, how economists see decision-making. First of all, we're using System 2. No mistakes, we're going to employ System 2. We're carefully weighing costs and benefits. That's something that is, at the heart of all of our models in economics. No cognitive biases. We make decisions by weighing costs and benefits equally. We're not influenced by a current situation when making decisions, so there's no context that's going to get in the way and kind of frame a particular decision that's going to mess me up. And we may discount costs and benefits that occur in the future, and we can actually do that and put that into our function. So that's something that we might do, and we only use costs and benefits to make decisions. There's no other sources of information. Of course, human behavior is very different, and something that economists are starting to do more and more is not only rely on models. So our utility theory idea is based on a model of how we would make decisions based on some of the assumptions that we've noted. In doing a lot of experiments, sometimes economists are shocked to find out that people behave very, very differently, and we get a whole bunch of outcomes that create a little bit of a puzzle, because the outcome of an experiment might suggest that people were acting irrationally, and then there becomes a challenge to define that. And it's not as if behavioral science is all about, well, people are just irrational all the time and, just make a decision for whatever reason. Behavioral scientists argue that this type of decision making is actually something that is kind of systemic. Like, we can actually predict it, we can work with it, we can actually measure it, can maybe even put it in our economic model. So the economic model idea and behavioral science can actually be pretty compatible. We can use them together. A few key things that we're going to talk about in this short video. So of course we're using system one all the time because we're cutting corners. This is kind of how we're designed, how our brains are designed to, quickly make decisions. They say don't judge a book by its cover, but, we do all the time. We make decisions on past experience. We are subject to cognitive biases. We also might use anchors and fall into relativity traps. Sometimes our sense of losses and gains, in other words, are related to the status quo. So, I could get a raise of 10%. I might be really thrilled about that. But if everybody else, in my workplace got a raise of 20%, my sense of gain is, kind of connected to this understanding of how everybody else did. We tend to weigh losses greater than gains. We'll talk a little bit about that. Tend to bias to the default or things that we already have. When you have something, you own something, you already believe in something, we tend to have a great deal of bias around that. We are very, self-centered creatures. We may have self-control problems, not us, right? And discount the future too much or be subject to present bias. This idea of, seeing ourselves in the present, in one way, but having a lot of hard time assessing our future selves. Sometimes we think our future self will be different than we are in the present. And we may make decisions based on fairness or other emotional factors. And that's something that we see in a lot of different experiments, the ways in which people sometimes make decisions outside of maximizing their utility because it's fair. Humans are very much about fairness. Prospect theory is something to note. It comes from a 1979 economics paper. It's actually fairly famous, very important work. And it has to do with the critique of the utility model that we've been working with in class, and also the whole entire aspect of some of the utility functions, because they often deal essentially with the way we make decisions about the good things in life, right? So I want to, maximize my utility. I can have, this vacation or that vacation, or I can have, party hats or books or whatever it is. Oftentimes it's like making choices between these various good things that I want, all these things I want. I just have to decide how much of all the things I want. And in real life, of course, decision making is not so much always about what's going on with what we want. But of course, there's a lot of decisions that are in a context where something really challenging has happened. We have to make decisions about it, right? So maybe I lost a lot of money in an investment. Maybe I'm looking at, poverty rates in my society increasing, or whatever it might be, how to make some decisions about that. And so understanding a little bit of our sense of gains and losses. We tend to judge things, good things and bad things, relative to the status quo. So people start from a certain place and have a certain understanding. And sometimes our perception of where the status quo is can be manipulated. But we often are looking at our perception of what's good and our perception of what's bad relative to the status quo. And people are very loss averse. In fact, losses hurt a lot more than gains. One way that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky researched this is they did some experiments in terms of people being asked questions about money. So say that I said to, Tyler, we're going to flip a coin. And if the coin is on heads, you get $10. I'll give you $10. And if the coin is on tails, you lose $10. When a lot of people are asked this question, would you take this bet? You could win $10, right? You have a good chance of winning $10. And it's a one-time bet, right? We're just going to do it once. A lot of people are very resistant to do this because if you have $10 in your pocket, you become very, very loss averse. You don't necessarily want to lose that $10. It's your $10. You've had that $10. Maybe you thought about what you were going to do with that $10. And people don't want to give up that $10. The thought of losing money in a lot of cases is about 2.5 times more like emotional than we feel it about 2.5 times more than we might a particular gain. Okay, so a lot of our decision making, rather than looking for gains, sometimes we're actually trying to avoid losses or avoid bad things, and that becomes part of our decision making. Even when people change the bet a little bit, like if I were to say to Tyler, hey, I'm going to, throw the coin in the air, and if it's heads, I'll give you $20. And if it's tails, you get to lose $10. We might look at that and say, well, that's actually pretty good, bet. Maybe Tyler should do that. But in a lot of experiments, people still resist taking on that bet. Even if we were going to do it multiple times, that would be a pretty good bet. But if we only did it one time, people are very, very loss adverse, even when the odds sometimes are in their favor. How people use this and this idea of framing, because in a lot of cases, we can use framing and choice architecture, setting up decision making, so that we keep in mind some of the elements of prospect theory. This is a very simple ad that you're looking at the screen. If you look at this and you say, okay, we noticed that there's this like orange button, start your 30-day free trial, right? This is all about me just clicking to get what I want. And then, of course, cancel anytime, see more plans, the fine print or whatever. But there's a lot of things going on in this ad. If I were to look at, what is it that's kind of being framed as part of my choice in this, partly is what I'm looking at is this button, but I'm also looking at people in the ad, who are smiling, they're faceless, right? They look ridiculous, but they're smiling. So I very much notice this like kind of white smile. Even the cat is smiling. And because they look so darn happy, I should probably get a Prime membership too. If you look at the boxes, of course, the Amazon logo is like one big smile. So, we should kind of note some of the subliminal kind of referencing in here in terms of the choice architecture or the framing. It's in the bag. We kind of have these, happy people on the screen here. We have another, smile here, another smile here. So there's just a whole bunch of this like positive feeling and whatnot. And so the way in which we work with prospect theory and also framing and how we frame our choices and frame our decisions and how we're in a context when we make decisions, that's something that behavioral economists are really interested in. If we look at, for example, this is where we see framing effect and cognitive bias is related to that, but we also see a little bit of prospect theory in here. So this was Williams and Sonoma put some products in their catalog, and it was like bread makers or something like that. And so ultimately this kind of fit with maybe some of the things in the video with the decoy. For a long time, they had this really expensive bread maker, $429, and they decided to stop making it. So they took it out of the catalog. And when they did that, they actually saw bread makers in general start to decrease and go down. So they stopped making the product, but they kept putting it in the catalog, the $429 one. So people would, of course, not buy that, because who would buy a $429, bread maker? But lots of people would buy the $275, bread maker, because people start to look at decisions relative. So seeing the very expensive one, the $275, it doesn't look so expensive. There's a lot going on here, with the relationship perhaps to the other good. And if we can look at the way you kind of look at the situation in terms of gains and losses, right? The way that somebody in a food store might see, 80% lean or 20% fat. We always see it as 80% lean, 85% lean, 90% lean. Because if you see 10% fat, that feels like a loss, that feels like meat that you shouldn't buy, whereas 80% lean, seems pretty good. So the way that stats are written, the way that decisions are made, often have to do with this issue of loss aversion, keeping that in mind, but then also putting that into some of the choice architecture or, framing it in a certain way. Something that we see is the idea of shrinking packages is like a big issue right now because inflation is so high. We know that people are, don't like price hikes, and lots of companies hate to see price hikes because it becomes very problematic from a consumption standpoint. One way around that is to, change the size of the packaging or the quantity of cookies in the package. The Girl Scout cookies are infamous for this. So is Hershey's chocolate, which actually varies by size depending on the cost of their ingredients. When ingredients start to become really expensive, the quantity of chocolate in the Hershey's chocolate bar actually decreases, but the price never changes. So people who are very much victims of status quo bias continually buy the product because they feel like the price is the same, and oftentimes the packaging is very plain and people don't recognize that there's actually less quantity of chocolate in any given year than another. So we're we're seeing a lot of shrinking packages right now. There is something called the endowment effect, and I'll put in a video on. The endowment effect relates to this issue of loss aversion and the experience of gains. There is any type of market transaction where you have a seller who is really looking for a higher price and a buyer that maybe has a lower price. Oftentimes, this is due to the fact that the good that is being sold by a seller, let's say a used car, has a great deal of value to the seller because it has a history with the seller. If I'm selling like this mug on my table or my used car, I look at that good as having like kind of some value based on everything it's done, for me. And because it's mine, I immediately am going to demand a much higher price. The buyer, who is interested in buying my mug or buying my car, has a lot less connection to this particular good. So once something is endowed to you, you have it, you have an investment in it, you kind of believe in it, right? It's really, really hard for you to let go of it, and it becomes a good that's more valuable to you. That's something that we see in behavioral science. I am going to just kind of point out a couple of issues of self-control, and before I do that, note a couple of places, because I just showed you a couple of ads and things like that. There are a couple of places where behavioral economics are making a really big impact. I think I noted that there's a lot of governments that employ behavioral economists. England, for example, has an entire area of their government policymaking related to behavioral economics. The UN is working on a great deal of behavioral economics with their sustainability goals. The idea of climate change and trying to be sustainable is a massive problem, and there's a lot of desire to kind of get people on the same page. And even with people who understand the problems of the environment and know that some of their actions could make a big difference. So a lot of us know, recycling, for example, an empty water bottle is a really good idea because maybe that could lead to, greater use of recycling and less, landfill waste. But of course, even among people who know that, often people don't follow through with that type of behavior. So a lot of this is based on once habits are built and the ways in which people behave are very, very routine. How do we change people's behaviors? And in some ways, this might relate to our lives, right? How do I stop procrastinating? Or how do I exercise? Or how might I, get more sleep or do some other thing that I'm looking to accomplish and do? There's a lot of research in behavioral science to help us do that. It's kind of like a willpower issue, but it also fits with a lot of institutions. There's a whole area of developmental economics. So like looking at countries that are less developed, and there's huge areas of ways to use behavioral science in an effort to try to get, for example, people who have, micro loans to move some of their capital in a certain direction and get a higher rate of return. There might be ways in which of working with people in terms of greater access to agricultural information, ways that they can depend on information that they're getting, say, from a neighbor about some sort of fertilizer that they're going to be using. Lots and lots of information about behavioral science is being used by institutions. So even though we might be talking about it about how can I stop procrastinating, recognize it's being used in the policy world to try to work with the behaviors of many people who are, kind of routine in a habit and are looking for some way of changing some of that. And for some groups, especially in the area of developmental economics, the stakes are very, very high to be able to be successful. For example, with a microloan, we have a lot of self-employed individuals in developing countries, and there is a large amount of kind of individual willpower and whatnot that goes into keeping some of that, kind of self-employment continuing. And that's something that a lot of economists are actually studying. So it may be of interest. Also, this idea of the nudge. Nudging comes from a book by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And nudges are very common. We have them at BCA. So for example, if I give a quiz and I put at the top of the quiz, be very mindful of, integrity is important or whatever. That's using behavioral science. If you see that right before you take a quiz, it's kind of anchoring some of your sense of morals and you remember who you are, and that you're not going to cheat on that exam because you're being told that integrity is really important, and it's a reminder of something that you likely believe but can, easily fall off that trail. So, lots and lots of nudges are designed to make new habits easier. Some places, for example, are looking at the size of the trash can versus the recycling can, making the recycling can much bigger and the trash can much smaller. It shifts our perspective in terms of understanding what goes where, and more likely that people will recycle in that type of involvement. There's also a lot of ways that people can be nudged to make certain decisions. We see this with the organ donation in the movie today. But in terms of sustainability, there's an expectation that governments will use a lot of nudging. Sometimes when I get my electric bill nowadays, it not only tells me the electricity that I've consumed, it also tells me how I've done in comparison to my neighbors. So there's a little bit of a relativity thing going on in this, and there's like a big smiley face if my electricity use is better than my neighbor's. If I've had a particularly bad month and my electricity use is really, really high, then I get an unhappy face, and I know that my neighbors are doing better than me. So this is kind of a way of shifting my use of energy in a way that is nudging. Okay, it's not telling me you must do this. It's not a law. It's not a command. But the nudging is a way of moving people to something that might be a more, kind of a good social outcome. The locker hooks are nudging, the idea of don't put your backpack on the floor. You could actually hang it up, and here's this big giant, locker hook. And of course, we see the recycling, image on the bottom left there. This is suggesting that, compost, what it looks like. I could do this too. There's not really a lot of choices in the way that, landfill is one option, recycle and compost, lots of other options. It gives us an idea of how to nudge people toward composting and recycling more. Okay. I will, kind of stop here, but see you in class.